Veni Domine, Maranatha, Sito Veni Maranatha.
Dr. Sanders holds a Ph.D. in theology from the University of Notre Dame, which is not the greatest Catholic university in America. His graduate studies focused on the theological controversies of the early modern period, including such topics as the doctrine of justification, sacramental theology, and the place of the church within a confessionally divided political order. He's currently serving as our director of divine worship here in the Diocese of Grand Rapids, and he supports the liturgical life of the diocese by means of ministry, training, and helping us catechists. He is our catechist here in the diocese, and he does a fantastic job. The title of his lecture tonight is The Problem of Religious Liberty and the Role of the Church in a Confessionally Divided State. And without further ado, let's give Dr. Aaron Sanders a huge welcome here tonight. Good luck.
Well, mic's on to me. The title was a bit of a trick. You did get everyone's names at the door, right? Because I'm reporting all you filthy bigots to the bishop. Catchy little title, you crowd into a church basement. Everyone who has a problem with religious liberty for miles around is here tonight, and I've got you. Well, hate to burst your bubble. Tonight's lecture will not be a defense of the execution of heretics. I happen to have some different plans for dealing with the in-laws, actually. No shock and awe. So, I chose that title to be provocative, but it's not just rage bait. It's offered in earnest because I do believe the Church's most recent teachings on religious liberty pose a problem, more than one problem, for Catholics living in a pluralistic society. Yes, not the problem of, oh man, we've got to extend religious liberty, but a problem of how we conduct ourselves and still advance our duties as Catholics towards society within that context. So don't want to spoil the fun laying out all the problems or potential solutions right off the bat. Instead, start with a super fast resume, a stroll through historical development of the Church's teaching on religious liberty. So no treatment could do this topic justice without mentioning one of the most prominent scriptural verses, maybe not the most load-bearing, but very visible in discussions of the potential for religious coercion, and that is Luke 22:38. Now, some of you have already called the verse to mind. If you're a little slow, I'll quote it in full. And they said, "Look, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough." Well, no need for commentary on that one. It speaks for itself, so just hold it in the back of your mind until we need it. It's not really until the end of the 5th century that gets deployed, and we're going back a little earlier than that, maybe a century or two, to the earliest documented witnesses to this topic within the Church. You've got early fathers or ecclesiastical writers like Tertullian, Lactantius, going on record as well-known witnesses to the fact that any true act of faith must be done freely. There can be no faith without a free decision. Athanasius is probably the most authoritative of the earliest sources here. He contended, and I quote, "Truth is not proclaimed by swords and missiles, nor by means of soldiers, but by persuasion and counsel. But what persuasion is there where fear of the emperor prevails? Or what counsel is there when he who withstands them receives at last banishment and death?" So far, so good. We've got a developing consensus in support of freedom. But then Augustine comes along and, well, as he often does, he complicates matters. All the way back to the time of Nicaea, so well before Augustine. Nicaea is about 60 years or more before his priestly ordination. We see that the emperors had begun deploying state force in support of Catholic orthodoxy. the Catholic hierarchy. And it wasn't too long before Augustine's ordination that Christianity became the official religion of the empire. Pretty soon afterwards, it would proscribe pagan worship. So early in his career, Augustine frequently engaged with heretics and schismatics, and he had been a strong promoter of dialogue, debate, persuasion. But as the empire brought various forms of coercion to bear upon the Donatists in particular, he had a change of heart, which he explained with reference to another scriptural passage, the parable that involves Luke 14:23, "Go out to the highways and hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled." As Augustine put it, coercion kind of works, was actually his change of heart. He said, "Originally my opinion was that no one should be coerced into the unity of Christ, that we must act only by words, fight only by arguments, and prevail by force of reason. But set over against my opinion was my own town, which although it was once wholly on the side of Donatus, was brought over to the Catholic unity by fear of the imperial edicts." So after saying that example was not singular, it was not alone, he says, "I was made to own that to this matter the word of Scripture might be understood as applying. Give opportunity to a wise man, and he will be yet wiser." So what Augustine was doing was correlating coercion with opportunity, because true freedom is not, as it turns out, perfected by our ability to do otherwise. True freedom, John Paul II himself teaches, consists in the ability to do what is right, to do what is good. So sinners who exercise their choice against God's law are said to be slaves, whereas the blessed in heaven, who have no ability to sin whatsoever, are the freest among us. Obviously, Augustine's perspective didn't turn the whole course of theology on a dime just because he went to a parable and found one more verse, but it did exert influence, and his outlook on the possible utility of coercion really had a lot of cascading consequences down the line, as for centuries the church, whether we're talking about her theologians and her magisterium actively promoting ideas or simply the hierarchy tolerating behavior in the political sphere, did allow a wide range of practices that disadvantaged or outright punished non-Catholics who were within the reach of Catholic political power. Lateran IV, we'll give some examples. It's in 1215, required among other things that both Jews and Muslims wear distinctive dress to mark them out from the Christian population. Non-Catholic houses of worship were required to be tucked in back alleys or somewhere out of view. Non-Catholics might be forced to listen to sermons. Now, everyone would say, obviously you can't force someone to embrace the faith. It doesn't mean you can't make them sit around and listen to it. And most savagely, we must bear in mind, in starkest contrast to modern moral sensibility, those who defected from Catholicism through heresy or apostasy might, after a few attempts at persuasion, be handed over to the state for execution. We might cavil about the relatively low authority with which Leo X condemned Luther's proposition that heretics be burned as against the will of the Spirit. Leo X condemned that proposition. But we also need to grapple with the fact that no less than the doctors of the church, Thomas Aquinas and Robert Bellarmine, upheld the moral aseity of those sorts of punishments. Very important to understand that they upheld them as something at least as serious as forgery, which at the time was punished by execution. So no one should run rampant with that, but the facts we have to deal with do involve some of our greatest doctors supporting this. So returning to lesser severity, though, in this history of coercion, the 1917 Code of Canon Law, and thus church practice well into the 20th century, at the time of Vatican II, continued to hold that the church has the native and proper right, independent of any human authority, of coercing delinquents subject to her by penalties, both spiritual and also temporal. The church isn't limited to holding out moral blame, some sort of merely spiritual penalty for your misbehavior. The church can impose some sort of earthly consequence for your spiritual malfeasance. So whirlwind history. There's a lot mixed up in there. Competing theories, competing practices for resisting, well, are they baptized, are they unbaptized, different standards. But the principle of religious coercion seemed pretty well settled. So it was entirely unsurprising when the Second Vatican Council declared the modern liberal philosophy of government to be at variance on many points with not only the Christian, but even the natural law, insofar as the state does not consider itself bound by any kind of duty toward God. Moreover, it believes that it is not obliged to make public profession of any religion, or to inquire which of the very many religions is the only one true, or to prefer one religion to all the rest, or to show any form of religion's special favor. But on the contrary, this philosophy is bound to grant equal rights to every creed. Now, I know you want to throw your hand up, right? You want to say it? Aaron, that's not Vatican II's teaching. I'll give you this. That was misleading because it's a quote from Leo XIII in Immortale Dei. So this is in the 1880s, about 60 or 80 years before the council. But I'm not quite ready to concede the larger point. For a fuller, more forthright disclosure, let's actually set the stage for the rest of our discussion and quote Vatican II's declaration, Dignitatis Humanae, at some length. This Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. The Council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself. This right of the human person to religious freedom is to be recognized in the constitutional law whereby society is governed, and thus it is to become a civil right. The right to this immunity continues to exist even in those who do not live up to their obligation of seeking the truth and adhering to it, and the exercise of this right is not to be impeded, provided that just public order be observed. So, that doctrine doesn't seem like it's saying the same thing as Leo's. In fact, an all too frequent telling of Vatican II, the account presented in most of my coursework and most popular histories of the council, says, yeah, actually, it's that simple. The council disagreed with the previous magisterium and overturned the teaching. And it's a good thing it did. But if the conciliar doctrine really contradicted the previous tradition, that would be, well, let's start the count now, a problem we'd have to come to terms with. We're not just talking about a single fallible statement from one pope or another being contradicted, but rather a centuries-long stable theological consensus frequently reiterated, including in the century leading up to the council. So, just some examples. Pius VI condemned the proposition that the church does not have the power of constraining and forcing the inconstant and stubborn by exterior judgment and salutary punishments. Gregory XVI famously called legal freedom of conscience and worship insanity, deliramentum for you Latinists, which Pius IX cited approvingly on the way to condemning the notion that it would be wise if non-Catholics in Catholic countries shall enjoy the public exercise of their own peculiar worship. Leo XIII undertook to critique and examine that liberty in individuals which is so opposed to the virtue of religion, namely, the liberty of worship. Pius X renewed Pius VI's condemnation from the outset there by condemning the proposition that the state must be separated from the church. So we leave out all the ancient and medieval just to set the stage with enough modern sources even for legal establishment of Catholicism and against religious liberty. All as of yet very vague, but facts to contend with. So if we were to accept contradiction, flat-out contradiction between Vatican II and the previous magisterium, at best, you'd be able to get to a draw, an unresolved question. But if the magisterium could teach something so steadily for so long and then immediately unresolve that question, why trust it now? That would be a problem. And there would be a further fatal complication to this hermeneutic of rupture on this teaching, insofar as accepting a complete contradiction would actually be an act of dissent against, wait for it, Vatican II's doctrine on religious liberty. Hardly an ideal strategy for upholding the authority of the council. So, I did leave out a very important bit of the quote I read to you earlier, and the crucial element that gets glossed over when reading the declaration through a hermeneutic of rupture is that by its own explicit terms, the council leaves untouched traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of men and societies toward the true religion and toward the one Church of Christ. Untouched here does not mean we're just not dealing with it. Untouched as in if we touched it, that would contaminate us, so we're going to leave it to the side. No, untouched is translating the Latin word integrum, which means entire, whole, complete, uninjured, vigorous. In other words, the only way to support Vatican II on its own terms is to read it in a way that affirms and upholds the previous magisterium. The trick is finding what the principles were in that previous magisterium that actually offer us the continuity to support Vatican II in the fullness of its declaration. Because what it's pointing to is not we leave entire every decision made in the past about religious coercion. It's pointing us towards society's duties toward true religion and toward the church. So we need to figure out, the problem before us is how we can, while upholding religious liberty as a good, which we are commanded to do by the church, to also somehow require civil society to fulfill its duties toward the Catholic Church and the truth that she teaches. That notion is not merely foreign to the American mind, even the American Catholic mind. It's nearly repugnant. Our national culture inculcates a firm commitment to the separation of church and state, and we've seen what horrors can be unleashed when those two get too cozy. Plus, you don't have to delve too far into the Catholic tradition to find yourself real firm supports for that separation. All we have to do is consider that politics and religion have different ends, different goals they're pursuing and different modes by which they pursue them, natural and supernatural. And that's a great start. But that on its own doesn't do justice to the fullness of the tradition. And if it's not doing justice to that, it doesn't do justice to Vatican II. So this is the crucial motivation I want you to keep in mind here. I didn't decide to lecture on this topic today in order to salvage earthly power, go back to the glory days when the church was in charge and could push people around. I don't want anyone, I want to be very clear, no one should get the impression that I point out this seeming contradiction within the church's teaching in order to undermine the recent magisterium in favor of the old. Quite the contrary. Strike it, reverse it. I want to ensure that I, and hopefully we, render submission of mind and will to the teaching of Vatican II, Paul VI, John Paul II, and all that has followed, which we will not accomplish if we just lazily assume, I've seen the good of religious liberty, and now the church must be telling me that everything about the American experiment is hunky-dory. I can go on about my business. So yes, defending the modern magisterium means we're going to have to accept at least some sort of coercion in religious matters as theoretically moral and appropriate. Trust me, this isn't going to be a big stretch because all of you accept it. Anyone who's ever forced an 8-year-old to go to Mass to fulfill a Sunday of obligation has coerced someone in matters of religion. There are also some real clear edge cases. There are religious extremists in the world who feel duty-bound and in conscience to perpetrate acts of terrorism. And guess what? We keep them from acting in accordance with their conscience because they've moved beyond the due limits of their liberty. So, pointing out that the church is saying society still has some sort of duty here towards the truth is not going to force us into a very strong position about what coercion is appropriate. There's a principled defense. It's going to have to find some theoretical option, but it need not commit us to the uprightness of each and every historic form of coercion. Instead, it's supposed to challenge us to turn forward, not towards the past, but look forward with a critical eye to our own behavior as citizens of a pluralistic society. Ask how we can be personally faithful to the mandate entrusted to us by the Council. So let's settle in then. Let's try to figure out just what a society and its political apparatus owes to true religion. To do that, finally, we pick up those two swords I mentioned earlier. The scriptures make abundantly clear that the early church was subject to more than one authority. There were powers that ruled the empire. You've got kings, princes, magistrates, and others who govern the affairs of the church. Pope St. Gelasius, near the end of the 5th century, described these complementary authorities in terms of the two swords presented to Christ by his disciples before the Passion. He wrote to the emperor, "There are two, august emperor, by which this world is chiefly ruled, namely the sacred authority of the priests and the royal power. Of these, that of the priests is weightier, since they have to render an account for even the kings of men in the divine judgment. You are also aware, most clement son, that while you are permitted honorably to rule over humankind, yet in divine matters you bend your neck devotedly to the bishops and await from them the means of your salvation. If the ministers of religion, recognizing the supremacy granted to you from heaven in matters affecting the public order, obey your laws, lest otherwise they might obstruct the course of secular affairs by irrelevant considerations, with what readiness should you not yield them obedience, to whom is assigned the dispensing of the sacred mysteries of religion?" Okay, we've got royal power, authority to govern matters affecting the public order. It's not denigrated in any way there as illegitimate. In fact, even the sacred authority of priests recognizes that supremacy in earthly matters has been given to political authority by divine mandate. But however independent and at least relatively supreme that political power is within its own sphere, it must also obey priestly authority, the higher and weightier power concerning matters within the church's competence. That sounds all fine and good inside a holy Christian context. Boy, we're not there. So, you're probably thinking, not all authorities who wield that political sword, the temporal sword, are Christian. They've not freely submitted themselves, let alone their whole societies, to Jesus Christ, or the priests who rule in his stead. Their political authority isn't even dependent on any revelation. It's derived from nature, for crying out loud, and deducible through reason. So in what way could the natural political functioning of a non-Christian society be said to entail any duty toward the gospel of all things? Well, it's another real speed run through things, natural law politics. But we say human beings are naturally social and thus naturally political animals because we can't reach our perfection, fulfill the purpose of our nature, the end for which God made us, alone. An infant requires nurture and education merely to survive. No one person can fully attend to his own needs for food, water, shelter, and defense without relying on others who have different skills, different resources. So the family, the natural and most fundamental society, is not self-sufficient. It can't survive without mutual assistance from a tribe or a village. The needs keep going higher and higher until finally we've reached a level of a state being the community that has enough diverse talents, resources, and division of labor to meet all its needs. Within that society, we call it a state because it has to have some authority. If we have to cooperate, we need some power that will guide and unite all those disparate efforts of the people with their different abilities and resources toward the common goal of allowing this animal who must live together to fulfill his nature. So back up. I said no one can survive without others. That's strictly true from infancy, okay, but once you're old enough and you've learned something from others, you could theoretically go off and eke out some subsistence living in the wilderness on your own. But Aristotle, so again, we're dealing with natural law politics, says such a person would be either a beast or a god. So without some divine elevation above the capacity of mere mortals, this existence would leave no space for cultivating character, wisdom, And in so doing, it would not be fully human. It would neglect the nobler part of a human being, who's not merely a social and political animal, but a rational animal. Our nature could not be fulfilled without the perfection of those intellectual, or dare I say, spiritual capacities. So the same pooling of effort, generational transfer of knowledge that advances biological life is supposed to, much more importantly, foster the good life, growth in wisdom and virtue, not only by individuals, but by society at large, because it's this collective effort that's necessary for us to reach our natural end. Secular authority, then, exists to promote virtue. Thomas, in refining Aristotle's politics, fully agrees. The end of the law, we're talking secular law, temporal law, political law, is to make men good. Every act of natural virtue could theoretically be legislated, required by law, even though concretely it's impossible to do them altogether. And in the face of sin and the fall, we'll have to tolerate a fair amount of vice for a while. But given those limitations, still the point of civil law and political authority is not to just figure out what level of vice we're at, calibrate laws that manage to keep us from doing damage to one another and make it any worse and just leave things there. Law is meant to be perfectionist, to foster virtue so that as we have grown, we will be capable of undertaking a more rigorous pursuit of the good. And that pursuit of the good, or the true, or the beautiful, is not some pursuit just oriented out into the ether. Who is the good but God? Our natural end is in God. So that natural political society and its authority can function pretty well, in theory, absent the fall, without supernatural revelation. But the big take-home, then, which the previous magisterium, preconciliar magisterium, pointed out, is that even though we should not sacralize the state, by which I mean elevate it to some position and dignity higher than God has actually created it, we must also never reduce it to a material function or benefit. Political authority does not exist to direct a thriving economy with a chicken in every pot. That might help it achieve its true end. It's a sort of baseline condition for people being free to now cultivate virtue as we're made to. But the actual end is to make people good, virtuous, moral. It's always value-laden. As Leo XIII put it, those who are in authority owe it to the commonwealth not only to provide for its external well-being and the conveniences of life, but still more to consult the welfare of men's souls in the wisdom of their legislation. John the 23rd, right on the eve of the council, declared that the common good is something which affects the needs of the whole man, body and soul. That, then, is the sort of good which rulers of states must take suitable measures to ensure. They must respect the hierarchy of values and aim at achieving the spiritual as well as the material prosperity of their subjects. The natural purpose of the state is to perfect man morally and religiously, even when only natural means are available. But if God were to reveal himself, spoiler, he has. If he were to reveal himself, then the natural duty of the state would be to assent to that revelation and guide society toward the higher virtue on offer through it. In other words, the natural duty of the state to accept and obey whatever supernatural truth God reveals. Well, the gospel is not some arcane, unknowable truth unrecognizable without grace goggles. Look to Leo again. What does he teach? Reason declares that the doctrine of the gospel has even from its very beginning been made manifest by certain wonderful signs. And reason most clearly sets forth that the church instituted by Christ, on account of its wonderful spread, its marvelous sanctity, and its inexhaustible fecundity in all places, is in itself an irrefragable testimony of its own divine mission. So even society, then, is bound to recognize this truth and to order its laws, which are ultimately backed by coercive power in conformity with it. The question, the real problem, remains figuring out what sort of laws are theoretically fit to this end, and who determines which one of them are practically appropriate. Well, we've only talked about one sword thus far, right? We talked about political authority, and there are two swords. It's easy to count them. We need to move on to the second, because God didn't just reveal truths. He also established, in pouring out his grace, a church to govern those whom he was endowing with supernatural capabilities, the baptized. So the bishops, especially the Pope, wield the spiritual sword to govern that society of the baptized. Like any natural society, the supernatural society of the church requires authority and laws to guide it toward its end. Let's stick with Leo. He's a great guy. Law is the guide of man's actions. It turns him toward good by its rewards and deters him from evil by its punishments. And all the rights which essentially belong to a society that is legitimate, supreme, and perfect in all its parts exist in the church, including the right to legislate, to judge, or to punish. So in many cases, natural and supernatural authorities, church and state, going to go about their business just fine, relatively independently. But their spheres of influence aren't separate all the time. They quite often overlap, for every baptized person is subject to both powers. He is not two people who lives in two different societies. He is one person in one society governed by two separate authorities. The two authorities, therefore, relate like body and soul. That image goes all the way back to Gregory Nazianzen. Basically, any theologian from that point on in the 4th century has taken it up and affirmed this. So the needs and ends of the soul are higher than those of the body. If the good of the body ever conflicts with that of the soul, the lower good, that of the body, has to defer to and obey the higher. So does it fall to the church to tell the state what laws are appropriate to fulfill its duties toward the truth? Well, one theory says, no. Not for the reason you think, but for the reason that the state has a natural authority. It says, once Catholicism has been revealed, Leo says we can figure out, it's right there. Any guy with a noggin can tell this is the truth. So once that's on the table, it falls to the state to figure out what to do with that. Its rulers have been taught by the church. Once they're taught, they can determine what's necessary to uphold the conditions that Vatican II says would justify a restriction on religious liberty: public order, public peace, and public morality. Those are the council's due limits. You remember, we all have a right to religious liberty within due limits. Proponents of this theory note that historically the church handed over malefactors to the temporal authority because it said, well, I mean, we as the church can't impose those physical punishments. We can sentence someone to them, but we can't actually inflict them. So here they see that the church at least wouldn't, if not couldn't, impose them itself, and the state must have some sort of natural ability to do so. Moreover, if perhaps not all religious matters fall within the realm of the state, we've already said plenty of times that we're dealing with natural law, and there is natural religion, so maybe anything knowable by reason could still be enforced. For instance, you could curb the practice of polytheism, as all the way from the Theodosian decrees we had done within the empire. Why? Not because it's bad religion per se, but because it's unreasonable religion. It conflicts with the natural law that tells us that there's only one God who must be adored as one. And think about it. Leo XIII taught it is a sin for the state not to have care for religion as something beyond its scope. So the state ought to consider religion within its scope somehow. So all of that, we can say that they're not just, shooting like wild and hoping something sticks. They're trying to pin that on some elements within the tradition. And at the very least, they are trying to zero in on conditions within Vatican II's teaching justified by grave necessity. Everyone agrees there's due limits. Like I said, we stop terrorists even if they think they're duty-bound, religiously bound to do this. So this manages to make sense of how the same Pope who promulgated the conciliar doctrine that man is not to be restrained from acting in accordance with his conscience also taught in Humanae Vitae that public authorities should ban contraception. The exact words being that They should not tolerate any legislation which would introduce into the family those practices which are opposed to the natural law of God. So he doesn't carve out, well, I mean, unless they feel bound in conscience to do it, right? This look at the secular arm itself as somehow at least mildly authorized has all that in its favor, but there are some major flaws there as well. The bishops who were voting on the conciliar declaration would get updates. They'd ask questions by the guy in charge of moving the documents through committee and ask him, how are we supposed to understand this or that phrasing? And there are several relationes out there that clarify the teaching to the bishops, but if I could be permitted to paraphrase them and mush them together, they basically said, well, we're not talking about the authority of the church to coerce. Okay, that's settled. What we're doing here is elaborating on the state's general incapacity. So that makes sense. Leo XIII, in various quotes, says that jurisdiction in all matters of religion, worship, and belief is reserved to the spiritual authority. Not just matters of revealed religion, all matters of religion. So now that we have this second sword, even those natural matters should fall under the judgment of the church. Religion, full stop. So far more people contend in trying to unite these two sides of the seeming magisterial divide that historic state actions in favor of religion were carried out as an agent of the church. In fact, even at the time, that's what many of the theologians were saying. The church didn't have any direct jurisdiction over the unbaptized, so anything that was allowed to be done against them was justified as a defensive measure to support the Christian security, an indirect authority for the sake of Christian security in the faith. And remember, again, against those who think the state has some natural ability to act here, every pope and doctor has held, as does Leo XIII, from whom I'm mining out all these things that seem to push against religious liberty, that no one should be enforced to embrace the Catholic faith against his will. That's just baseline. The only people over whom the church has direct jurisdiction are the baptized, and it's precisely over those that we've seen the most force exerted, but it's to fulfill obligations they've already undertaken through baptism. So that's where this line of argumentation presses things. We even have a doctrinal canon from the Council of Trent. The 14th canon, after the decree on baptism, defines that if anyone says that those who have been thus baptized when children are, when they have grown up, to be asked whether they want to ratify what their parents sponsored in their names when they were baptized, and that in case they answer that they will not, they are to be left to their own will, and are not to be compelled meanwhile to a Christian life by any other penalty, save that they be excluded from the participation of the Eucharist and of the other sacraments until they repent. Let him be anathema. So Thomas Pink is one of the primary scholars now arguing in favor of this spiritual authority in the modern era, and he notes that the 1983 Code of Canon Law, you may all recognize that as canon law still in force, the canon law that was revised precisely to embody the doctrinal and disciplinary advances of the Second Vatican Council, still contains temporal penalties. Canon 1311 says the church has an innate and proper right to coerce offending members of the Christian faithful by means of penal sanctions. And if you look at what some of the sanctions are in the church's toolkit, you'll find that apart from losing one's office in the church, your ecclesiastical employment, and thus your income, we have authorization to command someone to reside or not reside in a particular place, or to pay a fine or a sum of money for the church's purposes. So in Pink's view, while Vatican II did not doctrinally cancel the moral appropriateness of restricting religious liberty for a just cause, it represented a watershed disciplinary change in which the state would no longer be deputized to enforce the church's discipline. And lo and behold, we do see exactly this. In the decades following the council, there's a diplomatic push from the Vatican for Catholic countries to update their laws, including their treaty obligations with the Holy See, to remove various restrictions that had been there on non-Catholic citizens. State-sponsored coercion by merely human authority, as the council said in one place, might be legitimate in theory, but it's now fully outlawed in practice. So neither one of those theories, I don't think, ties up every single loose end, but it would be great if we could leave it right there where Pink has left it off, because it's a pretty acceptable terminus. There are some limits on religious liberty still theoretically possible, and we noted those might be the very, very mild ones of, well, I can coerce my children. And those would be mainly for extreme cases as well of definite violence, public disorder. So with that established, the potential conflict between the old and the new magisterium is resolved. When they seem to conflict, they may be describing things in different ways, but they're always upholding a fundamental freedom that cannot be restrained except for quite serious reasons. The unsatisfactory thing is that no one can tell you exactly what limits still are okay in theory, but the great thing is we don't need to figure it out. Why? Because it's the church who would tell us if they were appropriate to use, and the church has told us, don't use them. We've got no need for them. Why? Because the church, in fact, works most effectively by respecting, to the greatest degree possible, man's inherent freedom of choice to choose for God and thus to make a full act of faith. The more we uphold religious liberty, the more we empower people to embrace the faith. But, even though we're not commanded to use any of this, we've still got these lingering questions, right, about, well, what was that about the duty of society to uphold some obligation towards revealed truth? John Paul II gave a pretty comprehensive list of freedoms that must be respected, to the effect that everyone has to be free to publicly worship, proclaim, and communicate their faith, even to the exclusion of various social penalties we might call soft coercion. So if you were just thinking, okay, what are some of the mildest things I could come up with here? Well, he says religious liberty includes freedom not to be subjected on religious grounds to forms of restriction and discrimination vis-a-vis one's fellow citizens in all aspects of life, in all matters concerning one's career, including study, employment, or profession, one's participation in civic and social responsibilities, etc. So, we're being firmly told that we need to exercise the utmost of restraint in avoiding imposing the faith through even these soft ways of influencing people. But the reason I still see another problem here is that doesn't get us out of the duty that the council said it was upholding, this duty of civil society toward true religion. And it's not just the one declaration of the council. Two other conciliar documents point in this same direction. We know we had, substantial commitments in past papal pronouncements. We could try and say, well, minimalistically recognizing the truth means, we post an aspirational statement. We really think it's true, but that's where we're going to stop. Gaudium et Spes, however, precisely about the church in the modern world, says laymen should also know that it is generally the function of their well-formed Christian conscience to see that the divine law is inscribed in the life of the earthly city. And if we wonder what that inscription is supposed to look like, Apostolicam Actuositatem, on the Apostolate of the Laity, elaborates the effort to infuse a Christian spirit into the mentality, customs, laws, and structures of the community in which one lives, is so much the duty and responsibility of the laity that it can never be performed properly by others. So those two together really land where Leo XIII had already been when he commanded in Sapientiae Christianae to make a strong endeavor that the power of the gospel may pervade the law and institutions of the nations. That's full continuity. The council, therefore, commands us to inscribe divine law, not just natural law, on the life of the city. If you think the phrase, Christian spirit means nothing that can't be deduced by reason alone, well, I can't help you there. So Christian spirit is supposed to be informing and be infused into our laws and structures of the community. So how do we get through this problem flowing from religious liberty? We know we're meant to respect everyone's freedom unless, this is really necessary to serve the public good. And yet, how do we go about doing that without, how do we go about this other duty to make the divine law felt even in our laws and structures without immorally disadvantaging those who don't share that Christian spirit? The church seems to have taken most everything off the table, and because of that, I don't really have great suggestions. One of those would just be, we're looking for means of cooperation, right? Plenty of Catholic countries around the world have public schools that offer religious instruction. The church is in charge of licensing the teachers, setting the curriculum, but it's the duty of the state to support that instruction by paying the teachers, inserting it within public education, and so on. I'll be the first to admit that that's very weak, because I'm pretty sure all of those countries also provide non-Catholic religious instruction within their public schools as well. So that's not looking at the sort of test case out in the world and saying, aha, we've got something, Christian spirit in our laws and structures. But I think there is a more promising tiny little hook to orient this very vague conciliar mandate. We have to, as civil society, acknowledge the gospel, and yet we can't disadvantage others, with protection of the Lord's Day. Here we have concordats, so these treaties signed between the Holy See and various nations. In particular, I looked at the one for Poland. If Christ is King and Mary is Queen, you would expect there would be something else in the Constitution or the law there. And of course, in this treaty with the Holy See, Article 9 says that Sundays and the following holy days shall be free from work. So the agreement with the Holy See is not, you guys figure out some really neutral way to make sure everyone has, this vague natural law free day to contemplate and fulfill their duties towards God. No, it's that Sundays and the following holy days shall be free from work. You've got Mary, Mother of God, Easter Monday, Corpus Christi, Assumption, All Saints, Christmas, St. Stephen. Nowhere in the list, they do have a few more civil holidays like Independence Day, but nowhere is there a similar privilege given to a non-Catholic religious day. I think we've been sensitized enough by living under an agnostic liberal regime that we can tell the fact of not being allowed to do business on Sunday is a real disadvantage if you're also observing a holy day on Friday if you're a Muslim, Saturday if you're Jewish. And yet, the same Pope, John Paul II, a firm defender of religious liberty, who signed on to the conciliar decree, I'm sure he voted yes on that as a father of the council, and reformed all these other treaties to get rid of certain advantages, is still agreeing here in Poland with their new laws coming to freedom that this is an appropriate means for the church to be acknowledged within a pluralistic society, for that political authority of the state to fulfill its obligation toward true religion. So, Vatican, the Holy See, has reiterated time and again the great value of religious liberty, and it's true. So we don't want to dare to be any more Catholic than the Pope by trying to say, well, let's find other ways. But I think that hook gives us a sense of how we're called, not just by old bad time boogeymen popes and councils, but by the modern emphasis on religious liberty to still infuse our civil society with the gospel in a way that supports the practice of the faith while trying to avoid disadvantaging in any undue manner those who don't share it. So, there's another problem. Because that's all well and good if you are in remote position to make it happen, right? I don't know if any of you have been following the news. I don't think any votes to enshrine any sort of Catholic practice in the law of this country is going to get very far in the next few weeks, at least. So, we do have some similar laws to that Polish law that are sort of holdovers from our generically Calvinist past, but we have absolutely no political clout, no chance of enacting some kind of special privilege or acknowledgement of the church. So, if even with our weaker theory, looking for continuity as being a leaven for the gospel, and searching to have that actually be inscribed in our political life is what we're called to do. Like, what remotely realistic means do we have to influence the laws and structures of our community? Just to spitball here, they're mainly about our personal practice, so not necessarily even trying for political influence so much as thinking about how we behave as political actors. And the first of those would be stop settling for material good. So often you hear like, well, I don't really care what else goes on as long as the economy's running along fine, as long as there's no new wars and things like that. And again, those are preconditions, but we've been taught pretty repeatedly that that's not what our government is there to secure. So why would we settle for it? At the very least, we can be working to restore adherence to the natural law within our political order. Precisely what that political order is uncontroversially there to do. Say, well, no one's willing to do anything about no-fault divorce, I'll just settle for someone from the uniparty that has a better tax policy. Well, no, we ought to keep pushing against those soft spots within our society. In fact, things that we had been able to agree upon and mutually enforce as recently as 3-4 decades ago, right? And we should continue pushing for those and not settle for the fact that, well, politics has moved on, we'll just live with what we've got. But as we're doing that, we should also openly advocate the policies we're pursuing because they are good. What I mean by that is not because they'll maximize widgets, that are coming out of our factories or some other utilitarian purpose, but because they protect transcendent goods. We need to restore a religiously motivated culture of persuasion. And here, I think, is where John Paul saw the greatest benefit to religion within politics, that people need to be free to bring their convictions about the truth into that arena so that the truth can prevail. One thing that Leo XIII really hammered home, he wrote so many encyclicals about church and state over his time, but he says, look around. The state is a product of the natural law. So, everything about it is discernible by reason. But what state do you know that has tried to operate solely within the bounds of reason alone and succeeded in doing anything worthwhile, right? I mean, France, we had a great empire of reason for about a week before it descended into a terror, right? And basically anywhere we try to bracket off substantive truth claims and go to the lowest common denominator of, well, as soon as people start to disagree with that, we'll just take it off the table and focus on where our consensus is, things go downhill. Leo points out that because of the fall, we need religion even to clarify for us what reason ought to have been teaching us. And so Catholics, in pushing the state towards its duties, toward the truth and true religion, are meant to be that clarifying voice. That, yeah, sure, we can point out, okay, in case you didn't notice, you could have reasoned your way here, but we don't need to do it simply as rational actors. We can say, well, no, we ought to pursue this because it's good. And let me tell you all these wonderful things about why it's good. Family policy, we want people to have more children. Well, we need more children so that our economy doesn't tank, sure, but we need more children because children are great. It is good that they exist. And that is a message to bring into the public square. Third suggestion, character matters. Leo, again, Sapientia Christianae. It is fit and proper to give support to men of acknowledged worth and who pledge themselves to deserve well in the Catholic cause. And on no account may it be allowed to prefer to them any such individuals as are hostile to religion. So it's not just that those who are hostile to religion will ultimately pursue things at odds with the truth, but even elevating them to positions of authority is teaching society something. Thomas and Bellarmine, one of the points on which they agreed is that a ruler might be removed from office simply for being an unbeliever. Why? Not as a penalty for his religious conviction, but because his position of honor taught people that his infidelity was honorable. See, when we give people authority in this way, it would be a reasonable, implicit message to take away that their methods are acceptable, the ends they pursue are good, and that the sorts of things they profess are good. And that confusion is certainly tolerable for various reasons, and we tolerate it all the time, but it's another thing to not bracket away. Again, well, yeah, I may not like the guy, or I may not like this woman, she's got a horrible personal life and things like that, but I tell you, the trains are going to run on time, right? Well, that's not a way in which we can advance the cause of the gospel, because we are cooperating in telling people that none of that stuff gets in the way of the state achieving its end, when the state is there to make us good, to make us moral. So I don't think any of that is a wonderful roadmap for you to go home and say, well, now I'm in a pluralistic society, but Aaron told me exactly how as a Catholic, I'm going to get my way through it, and we'll all be okay. But I do hope it makes you think about stepping back from all that was inculcated in us with, an American upbringing, and starting to piece out what is good about the structures of the political liberties we enjoy. But on the other hand, what is confusing? What, in saying that, well, the state can't figure out what's true, what sort of message does that teach? And so how can we, again, with respect to all, still be voices for the gospel within this state, not only for our good as believers, but for the good of all we share the state with? Thank you.